Alrighty, folks, it's time for exposure controls, which means it's time to start getting serious. In this section, we're going to be going over all of the controls on the camera. Obviously, there's a lot of external controls with the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. There's also a lot of other tweaks and customizations and Fuji funkiness when it comes to setting the exposure that we're going to want to go through in here. So let's make sure we got a charged battery and let's dive in. So the camera looks like a very simple camera with its shutter speed and aperture ring and the little ISO setting embedded into that shutter speed dial along with the exposure compensation. And if you do want to work with these in a direct physical contact, it's a very nice and pleasing way of working with the camera. But there are a lot of other options and a lot of different ways of setting the exposure system on this camera. So let's break this down a little bit. We've got our three main components of exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. We have a program exposure mode option where we have shutter speeds and apertures in automatic. We have shutter priority where you get control of the shutter, camera takes control of the aperture, and then the reverse of that, which is aperture priority. And then of course we have full on manual with that. Now with the ISO, you can put that at a manual setting or an automatic setting, and it's still considered program, manual, shutter, or aperture priority. That name doesn't change despite ISO kind of having its own settings. So we really have 8 different settings, but we only have names for 4 of them. That's just part of the funky world of photography. So let's start off on the most simple of options, and then we'll kind of work our way more manual. If you want to have the camera in a full program mode where the camera is going to be figuring out settings for you, at least when it comes to shutter speeds and apertures, you simply turn the aperture to the A setting and you turn the shutter speed to the A setting. At that point, you can use the back dial on the camera to do something called program shift, and then you can also work with the exposure compensation dial to lighten or darken your images. Now, your ISO is kind of independent from this, so you can have it set wherever you want. So we're going to be doing lots of demonstrations in this particular section, so let's go ahead and get our camera set up. Now I'm going to take my aperture and move it over to the A setting. I'm going to take my shutter speed, move it to the A setting, and just for fun, here in the studio, I'm going to set the ISO dial to 800. We're going to worry more about ISO here in just a moment. Turn the camera on, and we do get a pretty good looking exposure here on the back of the camera. Now the camera, as you can see, I have it at ISO 800, and the camera is choosing 100th of a second at f5.6. If I didn't like that combination, I can turn the back dial, and you can see that I could get down to, well, let's see, how far can we go? We can go somewhere around a 1/6 of a second at f22. I could dial to the other extreme and go to 1/60th of a second at f4. So if you know your exposure settings, you can quickly make this adjustment, and it's pretty easy. Now the other option is the exposure compensation dial on the top, and this allows you to make photos brighter and darker. Let's first up, let's just set this at f8 and a 50th of a second. Okay, remember that setting, 50th of a second, f8. If we want to make this image 2 stops brighter, we can dial in 2 on our exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera. And by turning this dial, it doesn't just magically make the picture brighter or darker, it's changing one of the settings on the camera. If you look on the back of the camera now, you can see we're at a 20th of a second at f6.4. That's a notably different setting than we had before, and so the camera just changes whatever it has available to it to make it either lighter, and let's go darker and see where it ends up at -2. It goes to 1/60th of a second and f9. And so this is a very simplistic way of dealing with exposure. It's going to work out for some people in some situations. I have my caveats about this, but it's one of the ways in which you can work the camera. So we'll kind of notch that in there as an option that we can use going forward. All right, next up, we're going to get into the ISO, and that is embedded into the shutter speed dial. So you need to lift up on the shutter speed dial and turn, and you can go through all the different adjustments there. And so on the dial, just pick it up, grab it from the front and back. You can see how it just pops up a little bit, has a little notch there, and then you can turn it to the various different settings. And on the back of the camera, you'll be able to see what number you are set at. So for right now, I'm just going to put it at 800. That works pretty well. Whoops. There we go. Here in the studio. All right, so as you dial through the different ISO settings, the basic range that you're going to have is from ISO 80 up to 8000. We can do more than that, but that is the basic settings that you can get to. Now, the most important ISO setting by far is ISO 80. That is the native or base ISO setting on this camera. When you have your camera's sensor ISO setting set to 80, you are going to get the best image quality, the maximum image quality possible with that particular light gathering of the sensor. Now, it may not be the best exposure option depending on what you're shooting, but that's where you're getting the cleanest information to the sensor. Everything higher than that is susceptible to either losing dynamic range or adding noise to the image. Now, with this particular sensor, it's pretty good until you get pretty high up there. I'll be showing you some examples here in just a moment. So don't fear about shooting at 100 or 125, but if you can, shooting lower is generally better, especially when you're shooting at 80. Keep that in mind. All right, we also have an A setting for automatic. This is where the camera will set the ISO for you. How does it know what ISO to set? Well, it just looks at the exposure indicator and it tries to make sure that you have an even exposure for that particular image. And this can work out well in some situations where you want to manually select your aperture, manually select your shutter speed, and let the camera figure out the ISO setting. Not perfect in all situations, as I will show you, but it's kind of a nice option to give you a lot of manual control with a little bit of help in this regard with making sure that your exposures are even. Next up, we have a C setting, and we can use a custom ISO setting on the front dial of the camera, which means rather than turning the ISO dial, which on one hand is just kind of retro, classic, cool, but on the other hand is kind of impractical and not very easy to do with one hand on the camera while you're shooting. And so if you want kind of the more practical option, you can just turn the front dial and adjust your ISO by putting this in the C setting. Now, one of the other options is that when you do put it in the C setting, it's going to allow you to get to more settings of the ISO that don't exist physically on the dial. So you can get to a low 40 setting if you want. Now, I don't recommend this for most shooting because you lose about one stop of dynamic range. But when you're really in desperate times for getting a slower shutter speed, this is one of the options that you have available to you. By putting the ISO dial in the custom setting, you'll also be able to get to the high ISO settings of 10,000, 12,800, and all the way up to 102,400. So if you need to work in really low light or you need a faster shutter speed and you want to bump up your ISO, these are some of the options. They're not great image quality, but if you just need an image, they are there, which is nice to have. Now, the other option is, well, before we had just a simple automatic setting where it automatically sets the ISO, you can go in and select 3 different custom automatic ISO settings. And this is where you can go into shooting setting, page 2 of 3, in a feature called ISO Auto Setting. And you can customize A1, A2, and A3 to work the way that you want. All right, this is probably getting a little complicated, so let's just kind of walk through a few of these little steps in here. All right, so on the back of the camera, we have ISO 800. If I lift up on the dial and I start turning, we can see the ISOs changing. I'm going to go set it to C. All right, now you'll notice that 80 is in blue and it's with the front dial, and that blue means that I can manually adjust the front dial on the camera. Make sure I'm getting the right dial here. And I can adjust my ISO setting up to 10,000, 12,000, and then I go to these high settings. So you'll notice how at 12,800, it just says ISO, and then at 25,600, it says ISO H. So what that H means is that it's a extra high setting, and what is essentially going on there is the ones that don't say H on them, the sensor is changing its sensitivity and how much it's amplifying the visual image that's coming in on the sensor. When you get the H on it, it's doing it by software. So without the H, it's hardware. With the H, it's doing software. And the software isn't as good as doing it with hardware. And so the image quality starts dropping off. And so I'll show you examples in a moment. They get to be kind of low quality. So you don't want to use them if you can avoid it. All right. So back on the dial, we can get this turned back down to, say, ISO 800. If we want to go into the lower settings, we have our native ISO of 80, and now we can get down to our low of 40. Low of 40 is not possible on the dial itself. And so we're going to go ahead and just put this back to 800 for right now. So the other part, continue this part too, we're going to dive into the menu system, and we're going to look at this auto setting. And so on the camera icon, which is the shooting settings, we're going to come down to page 2 and ISO auto setting. So what we have here is we have 3 different options, and we can go into one of these options in here, and we can set the default sensitivity, and that's going to be the sensitivity that the camera tries to be at. And that's the ideal one that you want to be at. Most people are going to probably set this up to 80. Next up, you can choose the maximum sensitivity. So where do you think is the highest ISO that is good enough for your shooting? I'm going to set it to 12,800. I'll show you some examples here in a moment. You can make your own decisions as to what you think is the highest one setting. But I'd say probably somewhere between 3,200 and 12,800 for most people. The third one is maybe the most interesting, the minimum shutter speed. So what the minimum shutter speed is it is when the camera is going to decide to choose a higher ISO. And so you need to figure out what is the lowest shutter speed that you're willing to hand hold before the camera bumps up the ISO. So what's the slowest shutter speed that you can hand hold the camera? And that's going to vary a little bit from person to person, but you can go in here and you can select a particular shutter speed, like 1 second. I would think for many people, you might want to choose something around 1/30th of a second, because you can handhold above that pretty easily. Below that, it gets to be pretty difficult, and where you might want to use a higher ISO. Now you can also set it down at auto right there, and the camera will try to figure out as best it can for you. And so I'm just going to leave it here for now. And the idea here is that you can set up 3 different auto modes according to different types of needs that you might have. And then you can quickly change between auto 1, 2, and 3 rather than coming back in and customizing the one solitary auto setting that you have. And so kind of nice to have some different, favorites that you can quickly call up that you can use in different situations. Now, one thing to let some people know who might be going, hey, this isn't working for me, my button isn't working. One of the things is that front dial can do a lot of different things. And if on your exposure control dial, you happen to set it to C, we haven't fully talked about this yet, I'll give you a little sneak preview here. If you press that button in the middle, the function 2 button, you can switch between the exposure compensation and the ISO. You can see it only shows up on screen for just a fraction of a second. But if it's there, we're controlling exposure compensation, and we can see that indicator moving over on the left. We're going to press in the function 2 button now, and now we're controlling the ISO. And you can see when we're making those changes back and forth. And so there are more things that we can do to that, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But that's one of the reasons that may not have been working for some of you if you had your cameras set up in a slightly different manner. All right, let's take a look at the different ISO settings on this camera with an eye towards quality and noise. 80 is the native ISO. That's where you're going to get the best image quality. 40 is not going to look much different in this particular shot because it's not a big dynamic range challenge right there. Generally speaking, 80 through 1600 looks very clean on this camera. With the large sensor on this camera, we are getting very clean images. In my opinion, up through 6400, even up to 12,800 is very usable. But as you get to 25,000, things really start to fall off the cliff, as they say, in image quality. And so you might want to do your own tests in this regard to see where you want to draw the limit on setting your ISO with this camera. But for myself, I'm going to try to keep it below 3200, but if need be, I feel pretty confident shooting up to 12,800. So yes, pulling up that dial and setting your ISO is kind of nice. And if you just simply want to set one ISO and you don't change it that much, that might be an easy way to do it. If you frequently work with your ISO, I would recommend putting it in the command option and then controlling it with the dial on the front of the camera. You'll just be able to select through more options more quickly in that case. Now, as I mentioned, the auto ISO setting, you have 3 different presets. The default setting is the lowest setting that it tries to maintain for as long as possible. The maximum sensitivity is the highest ISO that it will go to before it works on something else or you just start getting dark images. And minimum shutter speed is the one that you really need to put some thought into. I think a lot of people would be smart to put this at around a 30th of a second, depending on how steady they can hold the camera themselves. If you're really good, maybe you can get down to 15th of a second. If you got a little bit of a tremor or a shake, maybe you're at a 60th or 125th of a second. But we also do have the auto option as well if you want to let the camera control that on its own. All right, so that was ISO. Let's change gears and we're going to talk about the shutter speed dial itself now, not talking about the ISO portion of it. All right, so taking a look at the shutter speed dial, we've got some nice numbers and letters written on there. A is for automatic. Obviously, put it there. The camera will look to try to give you the correct exposure by adjusting shutter speeds. Next up, we have the numbers. 4,000 is not 4,000 seconds. It's all fractions in here. 1/4000th of a second. All right, 60th of a second. Stop there for just a moment. There are third stops in between these full stops, and you can get to these by turning the rear dial of the camera. You don't have to do anything fancy with any other buttons on the camera. Just turn the rear dial and you can go up 1/3 or 2/3, down 1/3 or 2/3. And if you want one of those third stops, that's how you're going to have to get it. Shutter speed dial isn't big enough to have click stops at every third stop, and that's why they have to do it with the back dial on the camera. All right, continuing down, slower and slower shutter speeds, we get down to 1. That is 1 full second, not a fraction, although if it was a fraction, 1/1 equals 1, so I think we're still good there. So that's the longest shutter speed that you have with the shutter speed dial itself. Next up comes T, and this is time. This allows you to set either very long or very fast shutter speeds. And so you can use that dial on the back of the camera to select 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and so on, all the way down to 60 minutes in length. Now we do also have a bulb, and bulb is kind of like T in that it's a long exposure, which T does, but it does other things as well. Bulb is when you press down on the shutter release and the shutter stays open for as long as your finger is on the shutter. And this can be really handy when you don't know how long you want the shutter open. For instance, you're shooting fireworks, you open up the shutter, you're waiting for a big burst of fireworks, and then when that is done, you're going to release it. And so maybe it's open for 5 seconds, maybe it's open for 30. And that allows you to kind of customize as you go along the way with that. And it will close when you take your finger off the shutter. You do have to be very careful because pushing down on the shutter might vibrate the camera. Good time for using a cable release in that regard. Now, back to that T setting. What the T setting also allows you access to are very fast shutter speeds. You can go all the way up to 16,000th of a second if you have the camera set into what's called an electronic shutter speed. And so this is where the camera is capturing the images with an electronic shutter, not the physical leaf shutter on the camera. We're going to talk more about this in an upcoming section, Capture Controls, but I know a lot of you already know about this, and this is something that you can go into the shooting settings and control under the shutter type setting. And so if you select the electronic shutter speeds there, then you can go all the way up to 16,000th of a second. In any case, when it comes to shutter speeds, if you have fast-moving subjects that you want to stop, you can select fast shutter speeds like 500th of a second for sports and action. If you want to blur the action, you can set it down to 2 seconds and use a very long shutter speed. If you're working at nighttime, the bulb or the time mode can work really well for leaving the shutter open for a very long period of time. And once again, that cable release can help. Now, just a thing to remember here is that the electronic shutter is not available when you are in the continuous shooting mode or the bulb mode. And so the electronic shutter is a very interesting, quirky mode. I don't recommend leaving the camera in that mode all the time, but if you need it to access certain features like the really high-speed shutters, then that is a reason for turning the electronic shutter on. Most of the time, I would leave the camera in a mechanical shutter. All right, so we have our range of shutter speeds with the mechanical shutter from 4,000th of a second down to 60 seconds. The electronic shutter speeds will go all the way up to 16,000. But as I say, the electronic shutter has a lot of funkiness to it, which means it doesn't play well with a lot of other features in the camera. And so this is probably something you don't want to use as your default setting on the camera. It's something you use only when you need it. All right, next up, time to talk about the aperture. Pretty simple. We've got a dial on the camera. You can adjust your apertures on there from wide open to closed down. There are third stops in between the labeled settings you see on the aperture ring itself. And so if you want a third stop, you can add it in there. Of course, you can stop the aperture down very far like f/22 if you want lots of depth of field. If you want shallow depth of field, well, with this wide angle lens, yes, it helps to have the camera at f4, but you're also going to need to be very close to your subject because the camera with that wide angle lens tends to have everything in focus. But in theory, it is possible to get shallow depth of field at f4. Now, one of the things to note about the aperture is that by default, it's open when you're viewing through the camera. So when you look at something, you're going to be seeing something with as shallow depth of field as possible. When you press halfway down on the shutter release, the aperture closes down to the working aperture and shows you the depth of field that you're going to get in the final image. Now, I've noticed this in some cases where I'm shooting under very low light. I stop the aperture down to f16 or 22, and the image looks all kind of pixelated and noisy and doesn't look good in the viewfinder. And that's because not much light is getting into the camera, and the camera needs to boost the signal so that you can see through the viewfinder what's going on. That doesn't necessarily mean how your image is going to come out. That depends more on your other exposure settings that you have set. So that's just kind of a little quirk that you might want to know about on this particular camera. Now, as you can see on the edge of the aperture options is an A setting. And of course, this is where the camera will select the aperture for you. That can be handy if you want to let the camera control the aperture. But there is another kind of quirky, interesting option where if you don't like using the physical controls, and you can remember this back to the ISO and back to the shutter speed dial, if you would like to control those with a dial on the camera, there are ways of changing the mode over. So if you want to go into the setup menu, you can change this up so that you don't change apertures with the aperture ring on the camera. You actually do it by the dial on the camera, on the front of the camera. And I don't recommend this. I don't think I'm going to do it myself, but I think some people are going to want to do this. So let me show you how to do this. So let's follow this little menu shortcut. What we're going to do is we're going to dive into the setup menu, and we're going to go to the button dial setting. We're going to spend a lot of time later on in the class in here. All right, so we're going to go to page 3. So I'm going to quickly move down to page 3, and aperture ring setting A. So when the camera's aperture ring is in A, what do you want it to do? Do you want it to do auto apertures, or do you want it to do a command function? We're going to change it over to command, and I'm going to press OK. So now when we turn this dial, and it is already in the A, which is essentially a C position now, we can change the aperture by turning the front dial on the camera. Problem is the front dial right now is controlling the ISO. Remember that function 2 button? That's kind of right in the middle of that control lever. It allows us to cycle through the options. And currently the options are f-stops, exposure compensation, and ISO. If I change my exposure compensation to 0, kind of back to its normal position, it changes just between ISO and f-stops. So I can change it to f-stops. And you can see I can change my f-stops here if I want to shoot wide open. If I want to switch over to ISO, I press the function 2 button and I turn the dial. If I want to go back to the apertures, I'll press the function 2 button and then I will change my aperture setting. And so if you want to only control the camera with the dials, you can do so in there, but you're going to have to kind of press in and cycle through the options. Just kind of a forward note, the aspect control dial on the back of the camera, we'll talk a lot more about later, that one can also be set to custom, so you can also change the aspect ratio with that front control, and you have to press that function 2 button on the front of the camera several times to cycle through all the different options that you have selected. Now, while as fun and cool as that is, I'm going to change it back to auto because that's how I normally work with the camera, and I would like the rest of my demonstrations to go smoothly in this course. All right, something to note about general exposure settings is that the leaf shutter system in this camera is great. Leaf shutters have been around in photography for a very long time. You can use flash at all different shutter speeds. It's small, it's lightweight, it's really quiet. The one kind of caveat that it has is it's not real good at fast shutter speeds, especially with wide open aperture settings. And on this camera, using the mechanical shutter, which is the one I would recommend most of the time, there are some exposure settings that you just can't get to. You cannot get to 4,000th of a second at f4 with the camera and the mechanical shutter. It just won't work on you. In fact, let me show you. So on the camera, I'm going to put things in a very manual mode here, just so that we can really see what we've got going on. I'm just setting an ISO of 800. And on the back of the camera, you can see that I have f4 and 4,000th of a second selected. And those colors are a orangish red. Sometimes they're slightly different colors depending on how you see it. And it's just not available. If I change down to 2,000th of a second, suddenly we can shoot in here. If I try to change the aperture, actually let's go down to 4 and see if it doesn't allow us to shoot there. We're still not allowed to shoot until we get down to f8 at 4,000th of a second. So the chart that you see on screen here is showing you the unusable aperture and shutter speeds that you can't match together. Now, what if you really need to use those 4,000th at f4? Well, you can, you just need to do it with the electronic shutter, and that's a good reason for turning on the electronic shutter. This is it Fuji's fault or is it just the laws of physics? I'm going to put it mostly on the laws of physics. It's just difficult to get over 1,000th of a second with a leaf shutter. This one goes up to 2,000th without a problem. Trying to get it all the way up to 4,000th just gets to be a problem on there. And so there are some unusable settings. Now, I have included that chart in the course notes that comes with the full purchase of the class. And so if you don't want to try to memorize this right now, that'll be in there as far as the course notes as well. And so something important to know, the red settings mean you can't get there, there's a problem, and that's the issue on this one. Stay tuned for more information on this 2 sections away in capture controls when we talk about mechanical shutter speeds and electronic shutter speeds. If you want to change it over to the electronic shutter speed, you can go into the shooting settings, page 2 of 3 under shutter type, and select the electronic shutter for that. All right, we've been talking a little bit about this, but you might have noticed that there's some different colors that are attributed to the exposure settings in the camera. And that's letting you know whether the particular feature is automatically being set, if it's manually being set, or there's some sort of warning. And so blue means you have manual control over it, white means the camera has control over it, and red means there's a warning, you're not going to be able to make it work, or there's something else that's going wrong with the settings on that, and you should probably address that right away because it's just not going to work in the particular exposure that you have set up. And so just keep mind of those colors that you see in the viewfinder. All right, we've talked a little bit about the exposure compensation dial. This is used for making your pictures lighter and darker when you have the camera in an auto exposure mode. And it's a very fun, simple way of doing it. It's nice and easy to grasp on the camera. You can quickly set underexposed images, 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops. You can even do 3rd stop increments if you want to be very precise on it. And then you have the C setting where you can take control by the front dial on the camera, and you can use all the way up to 5 stops of exposure compensation on that case. And so if you use exposure compensation a lot, maybe you want to use that front dial so that you can access it a little bit more easily, or you can go a little bit further with the settings on it. If it's only occasionally and you like to have it done physically, then you can use the dial on the top of the camera. Now, as a note, as you can see on screen, nothing with this dial happens when you are in the manual exposure mode. So it is only changing the automated settings that the camera is setting on the camera. So the camera needs to be in something automatic in order for this to work. Far and away, one of the most important things to know about this dial is to reset it back to 0 when you are done. You don't want to accidentally leave your camera at -3 or +3. You can imagine the disaster that would be on all the remaining photos that you're taking in most situations. All right, we have finally come to manual exposure, which is my favorite way of working with this camera, pretty much any camera. All right, so we've got our 3 major controls: shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and now we're going to be using the exposure indicator over on the left-hand side of the viewfinder or the monitor on the back of the camera for determining how underexposed or overexposed the camera's light meter is determining the subject to be. So this is a good starting point for determining what is the best exposure. A lot of times that requires a little bit more knowledge and understanding of exposure because it's not always the middle 0 setting. Sometimes it's a little over, sometimes it's a little under, depends on the scenario. Now, what I like best about manual exposure is consistent results. When you have consistent lighting and you're going to shoot a bunch of different photos with different compositions, it's nice that your photos kind of all look the same exposure-wise. And so getting a large number of images that don't need to be tweaked and brightened and darkened in post-production makes for easy work later on. And so I like it for that reason. I also like it for tricky lighting situations where you have unusual amounts of light or dark that are going to throw off a traditional light meter. Doing a couple of test shots, checking things out, and really refining it, setting your camera up in manual, you can then shoot a large number of shots and then get very consistent shots in a very tricky lighting situation. And so you can adjust all 3 of those different settings however you want. As you see, there are lots of different options for doing that. So let's go back and explore our exposure mode options. If you want to do program, where the camera is really taking care of business for you, automatic shutter speeds, automatic aperture, you can choose your own manual ISO setting if you want, or you can have the camera take control of it. In any case, that's all the program mode. Shutter priority is where you prioritize the shutter speed. You're going to select a particular shutter speed and let the camera figure out the rest according to what it has available. I will say that shutter priority with a manual ISO is fraught with problems. There are lots of issues that come up, and the reason for this is that the aperture does not have many settings on it. And being f4 limited as its maximum aperture, if you go into a low light situation, there might be many cases where you've selected a shutter speed that you would like to work with. The camera does not have an appropriate aperture, and you're going to get a dark photo unless you take some other action. I think using automatic aperture and automatic ISO work much better together in that particular case. Aperture priority, I think, works pretty well in either case here. Works for a lot of photographers in a lot of scenarios, but if you really want to take full control, it's nice to be able to go in there and manually select everything. And if you need to throw in an automatic ISO, you can do that, but make sure you keep an eye on your ISO. Now, I want to kind of present some different exposure problems for you and just show you how working with different modes, well, isn't always perfect in life, all right? So let's talk about shutter priority. You're in a situation where you've selected 2/50th of a second, 5/6 at ISO 80, and you're taking pictures and you're getting fine exposures. And then you go to a different part of the building that you're working in, and it's a darker environment. And suddenly you're 2/50th of a second. Well, that doesn't work out so well because the maximum aperture here, the camera has control of the aperture, goes to f4, and f4 is not a wide enough aperture in this given scenario. And this is tricky because the image that you're looking at kind of looks normal. It looks fine unless you are looking at the red indicator down below that your f-stop is not wide enough for you. And your final image is going to be too dark because you don't have a wide enough aperture for that particular image. And so the problem is f4 is not enough in that particular situation. And what you're going to need to do is, number one, understand there's a problem, and number two, take action, which is either lower your shutter speed or raise your ISO. Okay, so awareness, knowledge of a problem, and an action. Keep that in mind. Let's try this again with aperture priority. You set a reasonable aperture of 5.6. You're at a comfortable 2/50th of a second. You go into a darker environment and there's somebody moving, and now your shutter speed is down at 15th of a second. It's too slow for stopping the motion. All right, so that's not the right combination in that scenario. You need to realize that it's not right, and then you can either open up the aperture and or raise the ISO until you get a shutter speed that is acceptable for that situation. So once again, you need to realize that something's not right for what you're shooting, and then you need to make an adjustment for that. What about auto ISO? You manually choose your shutter speed and aperture, and you just let the camera bump up the ISO if necessary. Well, you might go into a darker situation where the camera bumps the ISO up really high, like ISO 6400, and that is very, very unnecessary for the given situation. You don't need 500th of a second. You could go in and you could change the shutter speed, or maybe you could change the aperture and achieve a much more ideal exposure setting. Yes, you're getting a correct exposure, but it doesn't mean it's the best one out there. Okay, what about auto anything? Putting anything, any combination of auto that you can think about. You set your camera up for a nice shot, and as the subject moves through the frame, well, this extra area of brightness in the background has thrown off the exposure, and now your subject is darker than before. And it's doing so because on a certain technical level, the camera got the correct exposure in this image on the right-hand side of the screen. It's not actually correct for the car, which is the main subject, but how would the camera know what the main subject is? It's metering for all of the light coming in the camera. If you had your camera set to manual, it would avoid this problem if you took time to adjust the shutter speeds and apertures and ISOs to the correct settings. So once again, you're going to have to realize what your needs are and what the problems are, and you're going to need to set an adjustment. So automatic settings do not really solve all the problems for you. With a manual exposure, the way I usually work, I'm going to go up to a scenario. I'm going to kind of set my camera up the way I want it composed. I'm going to figure out what I want with my ISO, my shutter speed, my aperture, and I vary which one I work with first. And then maybe if I go over to a new environment that's darker, I'll look through the viewfinder and I'll first off see that it's really dark. That's a first good sign that something's wrong. I'll look over on the left-hand side at the exposure indicator. That's telling me it's underexposed. And then I'm going to look at the exposure controls on the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to say, are these really the best settings for this environment? And I'll make the appropriate adjustments for that particular setting. So once again, you got to be aware of your surroundings, understand your exposure, realize there's a problem, put in the exposure settings that is appropriate for that situation, and you get the right exposure. And I just wanted to show you that not all auto modes are going to solve all your exposure problems. They can solve some of them for you, but exposure is one of the key components of photography, and it's really important that you understand what's going on with the camera. And setting correct exposures, well, that's kind of your job one in photography. One of a few really important ones, but it's one that you really want to nail down. And so if you want more advice on photographic exposure, I do make an entire class on that. And so if you want to dive deep into the world of exposure and really understand all the different options and how it works beyond just what it does on this particular camera, you can check out my class, Photographic Exposure, on that. All right, those are our main exposure things, but now there's a lot of other little things that we want to talk about in here. The back of the camera, you have an AEL-AFL button. That stands for Auto Exposure Lock, and then later on it'll become Auto Focus Lock when we talk about focusing. And what this does is it allows you to lock the exposure if you were to move the camera around. And this is going to be a little difficult to do given our current studio size and the wide angle nature of this camera, but let's give this a try. So I'm going to put my camera into an automatic shutter speed. And so we're just selecting an aperture. Let's select an aperture of 5.6. And right now the camera is selecting somewhere around 100th or 80th of a second. But I've got more black over on the right-hand side. And as I pan over there, you can see it drops down to 80th and 60th of a second. And so if I wanted to lock that exposure in and reposition the camera, I would press in on the button. And as long as I'm pressing in on the button, it holds that exposure. And you can see even goes down to a very precise 58th of a second when I take that photo. And so if you were taking a picture of your friend and they're standing next to a bright window, you might move it away from the bright window, lock in that exposure, reposition it on your friend. That way your friend is properly exposed. The window might be a little overexposed, but your friend's more important than the window in most cases. And so some people like working with it in that way. Some people never use that, and they can reprogram this button. Now, this button does have two options. You can either have it as a press button, where it's only working when you're pressing on the button, or it's a switch where you just press it once, it turns on, and then you press it again and it turns off. So it's kind of like a light switch, on or off. And so if you want to control that, you can go into the setup menu under the AEL/AFL lock mode and determine whether it's a press or a switch on how it works. Now, if this is a button that you would never use, you don't do that sort of thing in the real world, you can completely customize this button, and we're going to get into that in the setup menu in this class, and I highly recommend that. For those of you who like back button focusing, this is a good button to program for back button programming. All right, next up is the metering system. This is how the camera reads light coming in through the lens, and we have 4 different options. Far and away the most popular one is multi. This is where the camera breaks the scene up into 256 areas, and it can really work well with bright areas and dark areas and kind of get you a nice middle ground, proper exposure. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best of the options. Now, a little bit more of a classical way of metering is with center weighted metering. This is the way a lot of cameras back in the 70s and 80s metered light. It's kind of through just a central portion in the middle. They assume your subject is in the middle, and that's where it's going to read the light. And so if you like using that system, it has that as an option. An advanced way of metering is by just doing spot metering on your subject. And so if you want to disregard light or dark areas around your subject, you can use spot metering, which just uses 2% of the frame. Now, there is also an average metering where it just measures everything coming in evenly. I'm not sure when this would be the best, but if one of the other ones or all 3 of the other ones aren't working for you, this is an option that you may try, but I don't have a good specific recommendation for who and where that is going to be best. One of the best ways of judging if you have the correct exposure is not the exposure indicator. That's just this one little tiny needle point that's going up and down. The histogram shows you a graph which will show you the brightest point, the darkest point, where all the information is. And you can get to this by pressing the display button on the back of your camera. Now, you might not be able to get to it right now because it needs to be checked on in the setup menu. And this is something that we can go in and program right now if you would like your camera to do it. So as you can see on my camera, if I press the display back button, the display does change, and there is a histogram, but we can't see the image at the same time. I would like to see the image and the histogram at the same time. So we're going to dive into the menu, and we're going to be in the setup menu, which is right here where we want to be. And we want screen setup, and we're going to go down to page 3, and we want to go to display custom setting. And so this is where we can customize our display. And if you'll see right down here on page 1 is histogram, and I'm going to give that a checkbox. And you can turn things off and turn things on in here, depending on what you want to see in that display. So I'm going to press the back button out of this, and now, voila, in that bottom right corner, you can see the histogram. And so if you don't want it, you can just press the display button. That turns off all of that information. It goes to this information screen and back to that histogram there. And so I'm going to move my shutter speed manually so that you can see what this looks like as you move through your different shutter speeds and exposures. And so it's a great way to work with exposures. And so I'm not going to go into the full explanation of histograms, but underexposed is going to be piled up on the left and overexposed is going to be piled up on the right. Generally, you want a mountain in the middle. Now, when you take an image and you play it back, you can hit the display button and the focus lever, and that will allow you to see the RGB histogram. So if you want to see the different color channels, you can see that. So press the display button to cycle through those different options, and then you press up on the focus lever, and that gets you additional options once you're into those displays in there. I'll talk more about that later on in the class as well. And so if you want a good system for determining whether you got the right photo, look at the histogram. That's going to be the truth detector as to whether you got something that's workable later on. It may or may not be looking great in camera, but if you know that you see a mountain in the middle, that means you're going to be able to have a lot of data to work with in the future. Now I want to talk about exposure preview. Now this is the way that the camera is set up by default, is that the image that you are looking at in the viewfinder or on the monitor on the back of the camera shows you a real-time representation of how light or dark your image is going to be. In most cases, this is great. It's showing you the white balance and exposure, and it makes it really painfully obvious whether you're underexposed or overexposed. Now, you should also be able to see your shutter speeds and apertures changing and your exposure indicator over on the left-hand side. Now, you can turn this feature off so that your image is only showing you in the viewfinder and on the monitor the best possible image. And this could be for focus reasons or composition reasons. You should be able to see with the exposure indicator on your left and your exposure controls on the bottom what you're changing and whether you're underexposed or overexposed. And this is going to be better when you use flash photography, because a camera can't predict how bright the flash is going to be and what it's going to look like in the final photograph. This is something that you would want to turn off if you were working, say, in a studio with a flash system. But for most users, you're going to want to leave this preview, exposure, and white balance turned on. And this is something that you can control in the setup menu. Next up, let's talk about exposure bracketing. Exposure bracketing is when you shoot a series of photos at different exposures, making sure that you got the correct exposure. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out what's best in the field, and this kind of covers your bases so that when you get home, you've got something to work with. It can also be used for HDR or high dynamic range photography, where you're taking multiple photos and compiling them into one photo that takes the best exposure information from each of the different photos. So by diving into the auto exposure bracketing setting in the menu, you can set up the various different controls in here. Now, you can get to this through the drive button as well, because you can go to the drive. We'll talk about that under capture controls. Select bracketing, and then you press the Q button, and that allows you to go in to the bracketing setting. It's basically kind of a shortcut that gets you back to the menu setting. So there's two different ways of getting there, one in the menu and one through the drive setting on the camera. Once you're in there, the first control is the number of frames and the size of the steps that you're taking. And so a small bracket would be 2 or 3 shots. You just have a little bit of exposure difference there. If you're a little bit more serious, you'll be shooting 5, 7, or even up to 9 shots. You can also select how far apart they are. Now, using a third of a stop is not a very big adjustment, and so a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people do like 1 full stop of adjustment. It's a pretty good notable amount. I like to shoot brackets with 5 shots, 1 stop apiece. That's usually big enough for most of the situations that I'm shooting, but other people have other needs. Another option that you have is shooting 1 frame at a time or shooting them continuously. Most people will want to set these up to shoot continuously, and that is because you're trying to capture a scene that doesn't change between shots, because you don't know which one of these shots you're going to use, and if you're doing HDR, you don't want anything moving between the shots. You want them all captured as close together as possible. And with the continuous mode, when you press down on the shutter release, it fires through all of them of the series and then stops when it gets to the end automatically. And that way they're all taken in as short a period of time. If there was something that you were trying to time very particularly, like a wave or something, you would do 1 frame. So it's an option, but I think continuous is better for most people. Now you can also change the order that it shoots the images. By default, it shoots the correct exposure first and then does an overexposed and underexposed, and it's kind of awkward. And if you shoot a lot of bracketing shots in a row, when you get to your thumbnails on your computer screen, you're not going to know where they start and where they ended. What a lot of photographers like to do is start with the darkest exposure and then go to the lightest exposure. You could do the reverse of that, but a lot of people like the dark to light option. That way you can see a group of bracketed images and very distinctly tell where one starts and where it ends. And so that's a very good option that I think would be good for most people to set. And so that's a good way of just making sure you get the right exposure out in the field. All right, another great feature on this camera is the neutral density filter. Neutral density filters are just really dark filters that a lot of times they'll attach onto the front of the lens. But we don't need to do that here because we have a 4-stop ND filter built into the camera itself. And so it's actually wedged between the leaf shutter and the aperture. And you can just, with a flip of a finger, you can put in this neutral density filter to reduce the amount of light coming into your camera. Now, most of the time, as photographers, we want to let in the maximum amount of light possible. Generally speaking, more light is better, but there are a few notable exceptions, and that's what this is for here. Now, there is a shortcut that is currently set up on the camera to turn this feature on. We're going to be talking more about the control lever on the front of the camera. There are multiple different functions, and you can either hold it out towards the outside of the camera or kind of push it in towards the inside of the camera. And you can either do a quick flick or you can hold it out there for 2 seconds. So if you hold it out for 2 seconds, and so you pull it towards the outside of the camera for 2 seconds, it'll engage that filter. Let's go ahead and give that a try. So hold it out for 2 seconds, and you can see it flips on that neutral density filter. If I want to turn it off, I hold out for 2 seconds, and then it turns that neutral density filter off. Now let's talk a little bit about why you would want to use this. Well, one of those important exposure things that most people should know, a lot of people do know, is the sunny 16 rule. So if it's sunny outside, the correct exposure may not be the best exposure for what you want, but the correct exposure will be f16 and a shutter speed equal to your ISO. All right, now remember, the best ISO setting on this camera is 80, which means you would set 1/80th of a second at f16, ISO 80, and you would have a proper exposure. And then you can play around with variables of that. You can do a little horse trading, one shutter speed for one aperture. You could get down to f4 at 1/1250th of a second. But if that wasn't to your liking, well, you can engage the 4-stop ND, and now you can use 1/80th of a second at f4, and f16 you're shooting at 1/5 of a second. Sometimes we do want slower shutter speeds, and we're limited when we're shooting under bright light situations. Sometimes it's for shooting shallow depth of field. For other times, it's for getting really long shutter speeds. And if you shoot video, you know that there's very specific shutter speeds that you should be at for certain types of video. And this will help allow you to get to those specific shutter speeds that you want to shoot when shooting video. I think it's really handy to be able to shoot longer shutter speeds under brighter light conditions. Maybe I would have been able to shoot this at f22, but f22 is not as sharp as f8. I wanted to be at f8, and it allowed me to be at 15th of a second. And so I wish all cameras had a built-in ND filter like this. I think that's fantastic. Not something you use all the time, but it's something that's very, very handy. All right, let's talk about tone curve. Now, we did mention this in an earlier section, previous section actually, and this is where you can adjust the highlights and the shadows independently. So it's not just straight contrast, more contrast. You get to decide whether the highlights are brighter or darker, and the same thing with the shadows. And so you can go in here and individually control these settings in here. So here's an example of either decreasing the highlights or increasing the highlights. And you'll notice that in the blue sky, how it's lighter and darker depending on our settings. Same thing goes with the light on the sidewalk. Now with the histogram, you can see that you are pulling the highlights away from the right edge of the frame, or you're pushing them closer depending on if you want them brighter. Now, if we do that with the shadows, well, we can increase the shadow region if we want to have even darker shadows. And you can see how that pulls and pushes the histogram in different directions depending on what you do with this. And this depends on how much contrast you want in your image. And there's a lot of images, especially black and white images, that look nice with a little bit of a pumped up contrast to it. But there's some cases where you don't want that. but this allows you to go in and control it. But be mindful, this is only controlling it on JPEG images. It's having no impact on RAW images. All right, dynamic range. This is where the camera takes one photo, it manipulates that photo exposure-wise, and what it's doing is it's trying to control highlights from getting too bright. And so what it's doing in reality is it's shooting a photo that is underexposed. It's about a stop dark if you choose DR200. And then it brightens everything up unless there's something really bright, and then it won't brighten that part up very much. When you set DR400, it's shooting 2 stops underexposed, and so can control even more highlights than DR200. And so this is something that, once again, only works with JPEG images and can be helpful if you often have highlights that are blown out that you just don't like. Now, kind of its sister program, very similar, is the D-range priority. Rather than, specifically having 1 or 2 settings on it, it has just an auto, a strong, and a weak, where it adjusts according to its needs for any particular image. And so if you are shooting JPEGs and you want to have this controlled, you might want to experiment with these different options in here just to see how well it works. Now, one thing to be mindful of is that the base ISO on the camera is 80. In order for this to work at DR200, you need to have something double that, ISO 160 or higher set. If you want to have it at DR400, you need to double that again and have ISO 320 set. And so if you don't have the ISO setting set right, you're not going to be able to set these features appropriately. So keep that in mind. All right, that concludes the main information about exposure setup in this particular camera. We are going to continue this conversation to some degree when we get to the image quality menu setting as well as the setup menu, because we're going to be able to customize additional controls when it comes to the exposure. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to know more about photographic exposure, I do have an entire class that goes deep into it, and it'll help you really understand what you're doing with your camera and be able to make sure that you are getting correct exposures in all different types of situations. All right, folks, there we go. As I said, that was a big section. I think everyone deserves a break because, forewarning, the next section and the next 2 sections are pretty big sections as well. So grab your little break now, and we'll see you in those sections.